Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Steve, for this wonderful event and for doing all that you do to ensure the integrity of education through UMass Lowell's online and continuing education programs. Congratulations to Donna as well. You're in very good company. And not because of me, but because of other people in this room who've also received that award. I live an hour and 40 minutes up the road in Portland, Maine. I make the commute 3 or 4 times a week, and I listen to a lot of radio. First as a child, and then as a scholar interested in how radio helped to shape the contours of 20th century literary culture, I've always loved radio. My first book was about British radio in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, I can't stand the giggles and cackles of early morning drive time DJ crews, and you couldn't pay me enough to tune into the latest celebrity news, which seems to be a good part of early morning radio. But I love to listen. I listen a lot. I'm also a dedicated channel surfer. In the morning and then in the evening in reverse, driving on the main turnpike and on Route 495, I go from Pastor Rick on WRKJ 88.5 and the generic confluence of country and Christian on 88.9 God's Country, to NPR, low down on the dial, and sports and political talk radio, pop and classical on the middle stations, and finally onto classic rock on Frank 107.5, and Portland's downtown groove on WJZP 107.9. I also sometimes especially enjoy the enthusiastic college voices broadcast on this drive from the universities of Southern Maine and New Hampshire, Emerson College, replacing God Country in Massachusetts at 88.9. You laugh now, but you're not going to like me in 5 minutes. UMass Boston, and finally, after the turn onto the Lowell connector at the end of the drive, UMass Lowell, WUML, on 91.5. So as a cultural historian who listens to a lot of hours of radio each week, people often ask me, they think I must listen to books on whatever we listen to books on now. I've never done one. I just listen to the radio. It's just hundreds and hundreds of hours that I could be learning about canonical classic literature, and I don't. I find very interesting, as a historian, the recent and rapid proliferation of Christian radio stations in my home state, my adoptive state of Maine. I come from Massachusetts. I heard a dozen of these stations in southern Maine alone this morning. Others accompany our summer drives up to camp in the middle of the state every year. Now, I'm not religious. In fact, I'm pretty reflexively dubious about the metaphysical claims and justifications of most organized religions and their purveyors. But I also acknowledge the, in many ways, positive ethical and social functions that religions can perform. So even though most Christian radio seems to me tonally analogous to the most strident and supercilious right-wing political talk radio, I find its recent expansion historically interesting, but I think that it also embodies at root a very healthy impulse. The very fact of its expanding presence suggests something important about what listeners want and need in their lives. I think that this is the impulse springing from a fundamental human need for connection that remedies isolation, and for comfort in a dangerous, cold world in which none of us lives free of tragedy and sadness, and for community that provides a sense of shared purpose and belonging. It's an impulse, this desire for meaningful connection, whose satisfaction finds many forms. It finds them on the radio, which creates imagined communities of the air. And I think this is the same impulse that inspired masses of strangers in Paris last week to gather on the banks of the Seine and sing together the poignant, desperate pleas of the Ave Maria while Notre Dame burned in the distance. Pray for us. At the end of the day, what better do we have than connection to holy mothers or simply to each other? The Irish poet, now I get literary. The Irish poet William Butler Yeats asked, "What do we know but that we face one another in this place?" A cynic might answer with Joseph Conrad's narrator, Charlie Marlowe, "We live as we dream, alone." The more optimistic among us will likely approve of the epigraph that Nancy mentioned, the novelist E.M. Forster's more sanguine invitation, only connect. Like, I imagine, most listeners in their cars hurtling past Haverhill and Methuen to beat the commuter traffic jam that clogs 495 at 7:30 in the morning from Lawrence to I-93. I listen to the radio to connect, to hear others in their places, to feel that I am not alone in the world. There's something about turning on the radio that's different from turning on simply recorded music. It's live and it's real and it's immediate. The Paris singers sang their prayer to be together. I find this connection and strive to foster it too in the discussion boards of Blackboard. I imagine that I'm preaching to the choir and that we all here today share this impulse because we're all devoted to the craft of online and continuing education. We're in the business of connection. We use tools unimaginable to Yeats and company in the early 20th century, but that serve the same desired end, to face each other, to hear each other, to connect. I understand that cell phone usage can cause a persistent and dangerous elevation of cortisol levels. And blue-lit computer screens feel all too much like the blue eyes of White Walkers as they create their army of zombies. I often feel like one of these zombies myself after too much time online, and especially after a year as interim chair of the English department. And I'm finding it increasingly difficult to disconnect from my mobile and my MacBook. But these technologies, emotionally so draining at times, are also making it possible for us to connect with each other and with ourselves in meaningful ways. They often seem, I think, to be magical in their potency. Virginia Woolf, the British novelist in the early 20th century, noticed this, and she wrote about radio's transformative effect on the texture of everyday life in the 1920s. She said, "The fabric of life was magic." Now, communications technologies and learning platforms are not, of course, magical. And I suspect they're a good deal less mysterious than graceful mothers of God who pray for us sinners. But if they're not magic in themselves, I think they can create occasions for magic. For some, imagine me using the obnoxious quotation, the quote fingers. I'm not going to do it. They can create occasions for magic, for what the philosopher William Desmond calls some golden thing. Whatever exactly this thing might be, that has, he says, no name in the technicist's vocabulary and no price in the economist's world. I hope that such a golden thing, vague and elusive as it may be, figures in the calculations of the powers that be, who cavalierly speak these days of content delivery through standardized instruction coming soon to an as yet unnamed global online campus near you. to forget the real purpose and nature of education, the aided cultivation of souls through meaningful connection to self, to subject, and to others, is, regardless of the amount of revenue generated, to court what Desmond calls metaphysical bankruptcy. But all of us here today, I think, are quite rich in ways that really matter. Diplomas and certificates of membership in honor societies themselves are not, of course, golden things. But what they represent ideally and what they signify here today in this celebration of the students being inducted into Alpha Sigma Lambda is a golden thing. What really matters and what today's inductees have achieved is partly a GPA, partly a numerical measure of academic excellence, but also something bigger. You've achieved connection with your best self and with others, and community with those others as well. And you've used every means at your disposal, including the technologies of Blackboard and books, to do so. I wish you the warmest congratulations. And I also want to thank you for reminding me of something important. On my drive home after this event, I will turn on, and as the hairband autograph did in 1984, turn up the radio. I will drive northeast through Massachusetts and cut through a corner of New Hampshire and pass over the bridge that connects Portsmouth to Kittery, Maine. And then I will tune into God's country and whichever version of Pastor Rick happens to be preaching this afternoon on one of those dozen religious stations. Whatever specific messages these stations promote, many of which I don't fundamentally agree with, still, the very existence of these stations, which take grand spiritual things as their subjects, bespeaks a fundamental and maybe even a growing need for comfort, community, and connection. I may not find my own comfort, community, or connection on these particular frequencies and amplitudes. But we all have our tribes. And these stations serve that purpose for a large community of listeners. My understanding of that fact, outside of myself and outside of my own preferences, outside of my own tribal allegiances, my understanding of that fact will reinforce your reminder that we can and should use our advanced communications technologies, above all, to create connection and community. These things live in the heart of the educational endeavor. So I thank you for the reminder that my job, when I log in to my own online class in 3 weeks, good God, is to create a space where we can only connect. Thank you.